Welcome to CMMC Unacknowledged, where we ask our resident expert some of the unanswered questions that were asked during last month's CMMC-AB Townhall meeting. My name is Todd Stanton. I'm the Regional Sales Manager for all things CMMC at Etactics. And I'm joined by the Senior Information Assurance Manager at Rain Associates, Ty Wittenberg. Welcome, Ty.
Hey, Todd, thank you so much for having me, and Happy New Year.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to our conversation today. All right, on this episode, Ty, we're going to talk about the differences between a scope for federal contract information and for controlled unclassified information. So we're really talking about a level 1 assessment and a level 2 assessment, and really the differences between those scopes. So I'm going to start with a statement from the level 1 scoping guide that was released last month that says, because federal contract information is a broad category of information, the OSC will likely focus the self-assessment on their entire environment. So would this be your advice to your clients?
So I think I'll sound like a broken record here. One of my coworkers and my leader, and I believe a mentor as well too, Paul Hugenberg here, always likes to say that we want to identify scope and help the client to minimize scope as a registered provider. So yeah, I mean, you could walk in very easily and just assess on everything, right? But I think identifying where the federal contract information resides, no different than the CUI, and having controls in place around that is critical to understanding the environment and potentially being able to incident respond as well too. If you put everything in scope, there's no harm, no foul in that. But I always subscribe to the camp, know where the data is, minimize the scope, which in turn minimize some costs. And so maybe that's not cost as far as me coming in to help with an assessment, but man hours that are required for somebody internally to do that self-assessment themselves, it takes time. If you can reduce it to 5 devices versus 20 in your environment, why wouldn't you do that?
I agree. And I disagreed with the categorization that FCI is that broad of a category that all employees would be within the scope, especially when we talk about using things like policies and procedures to transition assets that may be FCI assets to more contractor risk managed assets if we take that level 2 scoping guide advice. So I'm more in your camp to talk with the client to say, let's try to reduce the scope, even if we're only talking about level 1 controls. When we think about a large organization, like a Boeing, for example, do we really feel that all of their employees would have access to FCI?
No.
I mean, I'd like to say probably not, right? So you wouldn't need to do a level 1 self-assessment on all employees.
I'm going to definitively say no, right? Typically, that scope is going to wind up being, Todd, your sales and your procurement department.
And potentially, the team working on the contract, right? Whether it be something you're making and you need to have part numbers or quantities of the order, which may go back to information that could be considered federal contract information. But certainly, there are segments of your business that don't need to see that information, don't need to have access to it. So segmenting it appropriately would, to your point, reduce the scope, right?
Exactly.
So let's look at the level 2 scoping guide next. And they talk about 2 scenarios in regards to scoping considerations. So the first scenario assumes that FCI and CUI are all within the same assessment scope. So would you have any concerns with the client taking that approach?
That both are in scope for the level 2?
That all assets are within the same scope for FCI and CUI. That's kind of the first example that they give.
I would say, so I take it like a firewall rule. If one rule is stronger than the other, then it makes all the other ones irrelevant, right? It stops at number 1 versus going to number 2 and then stops. So if you're assessing for CUI, because that's the environment that you're in, CUI, FCI, once again, that data mapping is critical. I am betting at this particular point that CUI would bring something in scope for a DIB or organization seeking certification really becomes not only your sales and procurement team, but now your engineering team. So if you're doing the assessment and you know that, I think you can bring all of that into scope. Yes.
So if a client said our scopes are the same for level 1 and level 2, we have access to FCI in the same places we have access to CUI. Would you have any concern with that approach taken by the client?
To just do the CUI scope versus the level 1?
Well, to consider it all the same scope.
I would not have a problem with considering it all the same scope.
Okay. Yeah, I kind of wondered whether they put that scenario in there just to really highlight the benefits of the second scenario, which is, treating the two scopes separately by saying part of our organization, maybe a larger part, has access to FCI, but then a much smaller enclave has access to CUI. So therefore, we really have two different scopes. We have a level 1 scope, and then we have a level 2 scope, which is more narrow. Do you see advantages with a client taking this approach as opposed to what we previously talked about, it all being the same scope?
I think that depends on the size and complexity of the organization, right? And I'm just throwing this out for conversation and demonstration points. But if we're talking about an organization with 20 endpoints, then I wouldn't try to separate scope, right? But if we're talking about an organization that is over 100, and you have a team that clearly just works with federal contract information and never sees any part of the CUI, and then the communication with the client, not my client, but their client who they're doing the work for, and the DIB is between engineer to engineer, then I would just challenge. To say that you could separate scope.
Okay, I think that makes sense. For the smaller DIP companies, like 20 employees, you said, probably doesn't make sense to spend a lot of time trying to create an enclave within that environment to separate the scope. But when we start to look at larger, medium to large businesses, it certainly does, because I think the cost to implement 110 controls as opposed to the 17 practices within a level 1 requirement is pretty significant, I would imagine.
Exactly. There is a cost piece to it as well. And so let me back that up a little bit, because that was a little bit shameless of me to say 20 and then 100, right? But if you have a smaller organization where owner operators or managers in the organization are wearing multiple hats, where you don't have a lot of that separation of duties, I think that's where the scoping really kind of comes into play between, do you separate level 1 from level 2? That's better clarity.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's continue on with the scenario 2, where they've separated the scope. FCI is a larger scope, and then CUI is a smaller scope, and we'll assume here that they're within this bifurcated group of level 2 assessments that would be conducted by a C3PAO. So the C3PAO comes in. Would the assessment team be looking to revisit the level 1 controls for the entire FCI scope, or would the level 1 controls only be assessed for the CUI scope?
So say that for me one more time, that last part.
Okay, so we've got 2 separate scopes, FCI and CUI.
Yep.
We hired a C3PAO to come in and do a level 2 assessment for us. Does that C3PAO look at the FCI scope or only the CUI scope when they evaluate those level 1 practices?
So we're embarking on that journey, right? We just got the right before Christmas that we are going to, in the pool of people that are about to be assessed. And so my understanding from the C3PAO aspect is that when you contract with me to do the assessment, you're handing me over the book of the book of proof before I even come out to do the assessment, that Ty, this is what I'm doing to ensure I'm in compliance with CMMC level 2. If none of that information is in there about in that book of business about level 1, I'm not coming in to scope that. I'm coming in to scope specifically for the level 2 assessment that'll be verified by the DIPCAC and things like that.
Okay, so the scope of the assessment is really just that level 2 CUI scope. We're not looking at anything beyond that that maybe would have been included at level 1. But I think the important thing to reinforce is that those level 1 practices, they still are within scope, just only for CUI assets, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so I think that was the important point that I was trying to make there, that just because you self-attested to level 1 does not give you a pass on those level 1 practices within your CMMC scope.
Right. That would be in your book of proof, right, of what you're doing. And so it's not an either or. It's a build upon, like a pyramid. So you might have a foundation of 5, and then you got another 4, and then a 3, and then a 2, and then a 1 until you get to the peak, right? So thinking that it's only focused on just the level 2 and not having a good understanding of, your process, your system security maturity is relevant from level 1 to level 2.
And I'll ask for your opinion here, but I understand it's just an opinion at this point. But it brings a potential hypothetical where, let's say, once the CMMC rulemaking happens, organizations start self-attesting to their adherence to level 1. We don't need a C3PAO to come in, so we can self-attest that we're doing these things, these 17 controls, and you're awarded a contract based on that self-assessment. And then you get yourself in the queue to have a RAIN Associates or a C3PAO come in and do a level 2 assessment. And during that level 2 assessment, you fail because one of the level 1 practices within your CUI scope failed. Right. So now, even though you self-attested to doing level 1, by virtue of being assessed, it was uncovered that you're really not doing all the things at level 1. Does that make sense? And so what happens to that contract that was awarded based on that self-assessment? I mean, just an opinion, but what do you think?
Opinion is, if you go back to the federal acquisition, which is really kind of tied to 52204-21, you are potentially at fault of false claims as well, too.
And so as a C3PAO that's going through the process of becoming authorized, is that something that you are responsible for reporting back to the DoD if you identify that a level 1 self-attested organization failed a level 1 practice? Does that put you in a responsible position to relay that information back to the DoD?
I think under the code of ethics, right, I think you have a fiduciary responsibility to not only report it to the DoD, but you have to report it to whoever that client is. So if it's a Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman, you have to have that conversation with them as well, too, because that's part of the reporting process.
So along that same vein, would it make sense for an organization to hire an RPO to really, help validate that these level 1 controls are indeed in place and documented before proceeding to really that, risk scenario of engaging a C3PAO who may find otherwise?
Todd, I love you. I love that lead-in question, right? So look, I think you and I, through conversation and through interactions with folks at a CMMC summit that we participated is, we realized that when folks aren't really clear with what they're doing in their systems and trying to do it on their own, they just sort of make this assumption, well, yeah, I think I'm doing that, and they check the box. In some cases, it's harmless, but the reality is it's incredibly dangerous. That would be like you and I going to the doctor or going to the dentist, and they do the x-ray on our teeth, and they don't really look at the x-ray to see if we potentially have a cavity that leads to a root canal, and they go, oh, your teeth are perfect. And then they submit it, and I leave, and then I come back a week later, and they tell me I need to have a root canal. So to answer your question, and instead of me going down this weird diatribe, would be, yes, to partner with an RPO or an RP really benefits you, even if it's only to just come in and attest and assess and identify gap that you are walking your talk. I forget if it was Franklin Covey or somebody else that said, we are not good judges of ourselves, that it takes outside eyes and opinions to provide another lens of focus. And so I think that registered provider organization provides that in an ethical way, and helps safeguard you as a business. And then in return, to some degree, if you wanted to throw that under control, in my opinion, it's not an insurance policy, but it's like an insurance policy, a responsive control to ensure that you're doing everything possible and doing it the right way, even if you're doing it internally, versus having somebody engage with you as you walk through the entire step. So there's two ways to do it, but contracting with or partnering with an RPO or an RP such as yourself or myself, I think is incredibly important. What did my dad used to say to me when I would cut my own hair in high school? That a barber doesn't cut their own hair, right? You go to somebody else, you go to the barber to get your hair cut. He used to drive me nuts when he said that to me, but in the end, it made sense because I always had this horrible haircut that looked like I had stuck a bowl on the top of my head and had a definitive line.
Well, it brings me to one final question for you. And as a candidate C3PAO, I feel like maybe you'd be in a good position to answer this. So I understand the difference between seeking consultation, right, from an RPO and then hiring a C3PAO to do the assessment, and the conflict of interest between having one organization do both, right? So that separation of duties between consulting and assessing. But my question is, if an organization came to you and said, we want Ray & Associates to conduct our level 2 assessment, and before we get there, we want you to do a readiness review. So you're going to assess what we currently show from a documentation standpoint, and you guys conduct that assessment. They can still take that readiness review, and if you identify areas that they are not completing practices and they're level 1 practices, they could go to a different RPO and get consulting help on how to remediate that and still come back to you to do the certification assessment. Would that be, if they were hiring a C3PO, would that be maybe a process that you would advise the client to go through with you?
That readiness review is built into the C3PAO process so that it's ethical. So they hand over their system security plan and what they've been doing, or if they've partnered with Etactics and used your system for CMMC to document their journey along the way and prove their auditing internally and that they're implementing these controls. You hand over that book of business to the assessor that you select, and I review it beforehand. If I review it and I see holes in it, I should not proceed with, I should turn around to the client and say, you're not ready. And to your point, I would recommend you partner with a registered provider organization. If you're going to go through it on your own, then, there's areas on, X, Y, and Z that need to be fixed.
Perfect. Okay. Well, as always, Ty, I appreciate your insight, your input. Always valuable to hear your thoughts, and best of luck on the upcoming DIPCAC assessment. Hope to hear good news the next time we talk.
I'm hoping for the same as well. So, we're in the pipeline. It's the new year. So, in the next coming months, they'll be visiting, and, we'll see how it goes. So it's not about the end, it's about the journey. And, we're plugging along. But thank you for me.
Thank you, Ty.